Welcome. Today I will cover one of Canada's most shocking true crime case. The story I am about to tell is the Jennifer Pan case. But before we start, please comment down where you live and what time it is there right now, and like the video. Let's start. A daughter calls 911, her voice shaking as she claims armed men have stormed her home. Her mother lies dying, her father critically injured, and Jennifer Pan insists she barely survived. But investigators soon notice something strange. Her story doesn't quite add up. Tonight, we retrace the steps of Jennifer Pan's 911 call, the shocking backstory, and how the truth unraveled. Stay with me, because what seemed like a random home invasion was anything but random. When Jennifer Pan picked up the phone and dialed emergency services, she sounded like a daughter in complete fear for her life. Her words came out uneven, with cracks in her voice that gave the impression of panic. She told the dispatcher that her house had been broken into, that her father was outside screaming, and that men had tied her up before shooting her parents. On the surface, this sounded like the plea of a victim, the kind of chaotic information police often hear when someone is facing a life or death event. During the first listen, it seemed to confirm her innocence, but replaying the tape slowly revealed details that did not fit the picture. Seasoned investigators, trained to pick up on unusual responses, began to notice moments where Jennifer's emotions seemed to vanish. In one part of the call, she cried out for help, then shifted into a measured and oddly calm tone as she explained the situation. This sudden change, almost like flipping a switch, is something professionals pay attention to. In real emergencies, most callers show spikes of panic that are inconsistent but constant in their urgency. They lose focus, words tumble out of order, and their fear does not fade in and out depending on the subject. Jennifer's ability to sound terrified one second and control the next presented the first sign that something was wrong with her story. Criminologists often explain that when people are under intense fear, their bodies betray them. Adrenaline floods the system. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Victims hyperventilate, forget details, or provide repetitive, jumbled statements that reflect their shock. If someone claims to be tied up while hearing a parent shot nearby, the expectation is that their voice would carry frantic disbelief throughout the entire call. In Jennifer's case, something felt different. Instead of raw panic, her pauses and carefully chosen words gave the impression that she wanted to sound distressed but not lose coherence. That combination set off alarms for those listening closely. Forensic review of 911 calls is not uncommon. Experts have analysed hundreds of instances where words, silences, or tone gave away false claims. In Jennifer's call, one pause in particular stood out. While describing her father's screams, she suddenly stopped, as if calculating how to phrase what happened. The words that followed sounded deliberate, not the rushed sentences expected from someone overwhelmed by violence unfolding around them. To a dispatcher, these moments might have blended into the chaos of the night, but to police listening later in a quiet room, they were inconsistencies that begged closer attention. Another detail that created suspicion was Jennifer's physical state when first responders arrived. She told the operator she was tied to the upstairs banister and unable to move. Officers who reached the house found her bound, yes, but the restraints were far looser than expected. She had no cuts or marks that usually appear when tape or rope digs into skin during a struggle. Combine this with the fact that she was otherwise unharmed in an event where her parents had been shot, and the clean picture of a surviving victim grew harder to accept. In a true robbery gone wrong, intruders do not usually spare one witness while brutally attacking the others. Investigators began to wonder whether she was spared because she was never meant to be harmed in the first place. The contrast between her controlled composure and the deadly violence surrounding her parents only deepened the doubts. Police analysing the tape compared Jennifer's speech to other crisis calls where family members had just seen a parent shot. In one case, a man screamed incoherently for minutes before paramedics could understand him. In another, a daughter could barely string together a thought, her breath so laboured that dispatchers had to repeat questions several times. These examples highlighted the gulf between genuine terror and the strangely deliberate calm that surfaced again and again in Jennifer's statements. While she did cry and raise her voice at times, the structure of her sentences often returned to clarity, as though she wanted to make herself understood above everything else. What stood out most to detectives was the mix of dramatic flair and selective information. She described intruders, her father's screams, and her inability to escape, but her details often skipped over the exact sequence of how she was tied or why she was not executed alongside her parents. This selective recall, where some images were painted vividly while others conveniently faded into vagueness, gave the impression of someone shaping the narrative rather than relaying it. People in trauma do not edit stories, they spill them, fragments and all. Jennifer seemed too calculated in what she left in and out. At first, these doubts were not enough to accuse her. The call still held all the hallmarks of a young woman traumatized by something horrific. First responders treated her as the surviving daughter of a brutal home invasion. But as the hours passed, and the tape was replayed again and again, investigators began to shift their perspective. Instead of hearing the words of someone who barely escaped with her life, they started to hear the rehearsed rhythm of someone telling a scripted version of events. That shift in perception marked the true beginning of the case against Jennifer Pan. What she may have intended to use as proof of her innocence instead became the very thread that investigators tugged to unravel the entire story. One call, made in desperation, turned from evidence of survival to the first brick in a wall of suspicion. From that moment forward, every detail provided by Jennifer would be examined not just for accuracy, but for intent. Her carefully performed fear could only carry the story so far. Once police realized her calm moments did not align with true panic, they opened doors to questions about her character, her motives, and her history. They understood that something about this young woman's life, before that November night, might explain why she handled terror the way she did. And to understand why Jennifer was making this call at all, investigators and the public alike needed to go back to her childhood, her strict household, and the life she constructed behind a veil of lies. Only then, would the strange tone of her voice that night start to make sense. Jennifer Pan grew up in a home built on hard work and sacrifice. Her parents, Han and Bitch, were part of the group known as Viet Hoa, ethnic Chinese refugees from Vietnam, who had fled after the war. They reached Canada in the late 1970s and carried with them the scars of starting over with nothing. For them, settling in Ontario was not about comfort, it was about survival, and survival meant securing a future where their children would never face the instability they had endured. Every decision that followed, from their daily labor to their parenting style, came out of that mindset. Han took a job as a tool and die maker, while Bitch worked at Magna International producing car parts. Neither job was glamorous, but both provided steady paychecks. Fully aware of the chances they never had back home, they poured their energy into giving their children better opportunities. That desire translated into household rules that were far from flexible. Jennifer and her younger brother Felix were raised in Markham, a suburb of Toronto with a large immigrant community. The Pan home reflected values familiar to many first-generation families: strict oversight of academics, limited social freedom, and an emphasis on discipline. Education was viewed as the main path to social advancement, and Han in particular saw excellence as non-negotiable. A friend of Jennifer's would later call him a classic tiger dad. It was not meant as an insult so much as a descriptor of his relentless expectations. His wife Bitch took on the role of supporter in this approach, described as his reluctant accomplice. While she cared deeply about her children's happiness, she stayed aligned with her husband's standards, even when they pushed hard on Jennifer. Jennifer's routine was filled with activities designed to cultivate skill and resilience. She took music lessons where she studied theory and harmony. She played the flute in the school band, and at one time, she trained heavily in figure skating. There was genuine talent there, ambition even, and for a while she dreamed of competing as an Olympic skater. But dreams do not always align with reality. A knee injury cut short her skating life, and with it, one of the few outlets where she could excel outside academics. Without skating, her parents shifted expectations even more onto her school performance. With Felix still younger, Jennifer became the focal point for their investment of time, pressure, and hope. The weight of those expectations followed her everywhere. While many teenagers might attend dances or enjoy late nights with friends, Jennifer's world did not include such freedoms. Her parents refused to allow her to date, convinced it would distract her. They did not permit parties, and even closely monitored her friends and the hours she kept. Often, one parent would drive Jennifer to and from school, eliminating the chance of lingering on her own. If she went to lessons or extracurriculars, the same routine applied. The monitoring was constant, and the message was clear. Her purpose was to achieve, and there was little room left for normal teenage rebellion. That tension between her desires and her parents' demands left Jennifer with few outlets for self-expression. Classmates would spend weekends at social events or in casual relationships, while she remained absent, weaving occasional excuses about commitments at home. She understood the role her parents expected her to play, and by most outward impressions, she played it well. Bright, polite, and seemingly obedient, Jennifer fit the template of the child Han and Bitch wanted. But inside, she was beginning to feel the isolation of a life lived under observation. Every time she watched her peers enjoy freedoms she was not allowed, She felt a growing gap between the world she inhabited at home and the one she longed for outside. The emotional weight of this contradiction cannot be underestimated. During the later trial, Jennifer herself testified that she felt like a failure. For her, struggling to live up to high bars was not just about disappointing teachers or even herself. It was about the crushing sense that she was disappointing her parents, the two people who had built their lives around the idea that she would rise where they never could. It is one thing for a teenager to feel average in a world of achievers. It is another to feel that every step short of perfection is a cut into a parent's sacrifice. That emotional load created fertile ground for secrecy. This type of environment, labeled by some as tiger parenting, has often been debated in discussions of immigrant families. Advocates point out that it produces discipline, resilience, and achievement. Critics warn it can harm the child's psychological state when constant pressure is applied without space for individuality. For Jennifer, her reality was not abstract. She lived daily with oversight, firm rules, and strict guidelines. She had structure, but very limited trust. She had focus, but no autonomy. The balance tipped unevenly toward achievement, with little space for trial and error. As time went on, Jennifer found her desire for independence growing stronger. She wanted to be like her classmates who could date openly, attend school dances, or simply hang out without an interrogation. She also wanted recognition for who she was outside of grades and accomplishments. Her parents did not see these wants as part of her success story. They saw them as distractions threatening to derail years of effort. The result was a clash not only of values, but of perspectives. Han and Bitch viewed themselves as protectors, steering their daughter towards secure success. Jennifer increasingly saw them as wardens in a prison built out of expectations. When she began hiding small things from her parents, it was not initially about rebellion. It was about survival in an environment where telling the whole truth meant inevitable punishment. If she struggled in school, it was safer to avoid the conversation than to admit weakness. If she had an interest in boys, it was easier to keep it private than to fight over restrictions. Little by little, these omissions became part of her communication pattern. She was not yet living a full double life, but her silence and excuses were beginning to lay the groundwork. This gradual shift into secrecy was the predictable outcome of the world in which she grew up. With no room for compromise, Jennifer learned to compartmentalize. She presented the model daughter to her parents, while internally carrying guilt and growing bitterness. From their perspective, they had built a concrete plan for her future, fortified by rules that would keep her on track. From her perspective, she was trapped in a cycle of expectations she could not fully meet and was not allowed to question. The seeds of deception were already planted long before the night she called 911. The Pan household, structured on discipline and success, had produced a girl who learned that hiding was the only way to cope. She did not rebel outwardly the way some teens might. Instead, her resistance took the form of stories and omissions, and those seeds would grow larger over the years to come. Small lies that seemed harmless in the moment became practice for something else, a staged version of reality, a game to maintain appearances. The strict rules had created a situation where truth began to feel more dangerous than lies. In that pressurized environment, Jennifer started building the framework of the life her parents wanted to see and the entirely different life she wanted for herself. And it was only a matter of time before those hidden parts would spiral into a carefully constructed double life that no one in the Pan household could have imagined. By the time Jennifer Pan entered high school, the pressure in her household was clear. Her parents expected nothing less than perfect marks, and for a while, she could make them believe she was meeting those standards. The truth, however, was different. In most of her classes, Jennifer's grades hovered in the 70s, a respectable level for many students, but far from the straight, as her parents demanded. There was only one subject where she excelled naturally: music. But that was not enough to satisfy the future her parents had imagined for her. With every poor test result, the fear of bringing it home grew stronger, and with that fear came a decision that would change the way she lived her life. Instead of admitting her difficulties, Jennifer learned how to bend reality into the shape her parents wanted to see. She began making changes to her report cards, turning average grades into inflated numbers. Forged progress reports with penciled in, as made their way into her parents' hands, and they celebrated a success that did not exist. For Han and Bitch, their daughter appeared to be thriving. For Jennifer, each new forgery bought her a little more time. What started as a way to cover one disappointing mark evolved into a survival tactic. Once the first fabricated document worked, the temptation to repeat it was impossible to ignore. Covering up became routine. Every semester brought new challenges, and every semester required more creativity to hide them. Calculated edits on official documents soon escalated into more ambitious fraud. Jennifer did not just alter grades, she created an entire illusion of academic achievement. She wrote fake acceptance letters to universities, proof that her hard work had paid off. When Ryerson University rescinded her early admission after she failed calculus in grade 12, she could not bring herself to share the truth. Confessing failure to her parents seemed unthinkable. The only option she saw was to expand her lies. And expand she did. To keep up the appearance of attending university, Jennifer developed an elaborate story. She borrowed second-hand textbooks and filled notebooks with carefully written notes copied from pharmacology videos, showing them to her parents as evidence of her studies. To anyone else, this might have seemed like too much effort. But to Jennifer, it was the cost of keeping her parents' perception intact. She even told them she had won scholarships, piling accomplishment upon accomplishment that did not exist. Each false claim raised their expectations higher, which made the reality of her situation all the more impossible to reveal. Maintaining the illusion required structure. Jennifer would leave the house at the time her parents thought she was heading to campus, then spend hours in libraries or with friends, creating the appearance of a typical student schedule. She told them she had labs to attend, exams to prepare for, and assignments to finish. At home, she reinforced these stories with her stacks of study materials. There was a rhythm to it, one that became as natural as breathing. The more convincing the performance, the safer she felt. But it also meant that with every success in lying, her ability to tell the truth grew smaller. Han and Bitch believed their daughter was advancing toward medical school. They told friends about her academic path with pride, certain her future was secure. This good news spread through their community, creating an image of Jennifer as the ideal daughter, disciplined and destined for success. Every time her parents shared these supposed accomplishments, Jennifer's false world gained another layer of validation. She could not take it back without unraveling everything at once. Instead, she leaned further into deception, convincing herself it was worth it to protect her parents from disappointment. Her lies became more than protection. They became identity. At home, she was the driven student on her way to a medical career. In reality, she was a young woman, struggling academically, anxious about failure, and buried in the weight of expectations she could not meet. The gap between those two versions of her life kept widening. To her parents, she was an inspiration. In private, she was building an empire of forgeries. That dual existence required constant maintenance. Every new semester forced another invention. Every chance encounter with reality threatened to destroy it all. The effort was draining, but giving up seemed impossible. There was always another cover story to write, another piece of evidence to forge. When friends asked probing questions or when her parents pressed for more detail, she learned to think quickly, offering enough information to maintain trust without revealing the truth. In quiet moments, she probably knew how fragile her setup was. Yet, she kept feeding it, convinced it was safer to live inside the construction than to risk being exposed. This was not only about preserving her parents' pride, it was about control. For so long, Jennifer had been the subject of choices made for her: what to study, how to spend her time, even who to see. In fabricating her life, she carved out space where she decided the script. The irony was that this control was only possible through deception, and deception had its limits. Each success bound her tighter to the lies, until the line between her real self and the one her parents believed in became nearly impossible to separate. By the time she began pretending to attend the University of Toronto, Jennifer had turned deception into daily practice. Some people fake a story and stop, leaving it behind with regret. Jennifer built a lifestyle around it. Lying was no longer a choice. It was the foundation that held together her relationship with her family. It gave her parents stories to be proud of, and it gave Jennifer a shield from the disappointment she feared more than anything else. But it also left her trapped. With every passing year, she had to invent more, spend more energy, and tie herself further to a version of life that could never be real. What began with a simple change on a high school report card had grown into something far larger than Jennifer may have ever intended. She was not just hiding a low grade anymore. She was fabricating an entire future. It was no longer only about buying time, but about sustaining appearances at all costs. And while her parents celebrated the daughter they thought they had raised, Jennifer was sinking further into deceit. The expectation of success had given her no space to admit failure, and in the silence of that gap, she created lies big enough to live inside. Over time, deception became her second nature, stitched into every conversation and every family interaction. She had become skilled at maintaining parallel versions of her life, managing them with precision, But this precision came at a price. Each added layer made it harder to ever come clean. By building her life on fiction, she had set herself on a path where the truth was not only buried but unsafe. It was a pattern that only grew stronger as she stepped further into adulthood. Jennifer Pan met Daniel Wong when they were teenagers in high school. From the beginning, their connection stood out not because it was extraordinary, but because it was not allowed. For Jennifer, raised under constant watch in a controlled household, Daniel represented the one thing she was not supposed to have. He worked at a Boston pizza restaurant, later becoming a manager there, and also had a side involvement in marijuana dealing. To Han and Bitch, Daniel was not the picture of stability they demanded for their daughter. In their eyes, he was unsuitable in every way, but for Jennifer, Daniel became the symbol of the freedom she had been missing. Being with Daniel gave her something her life at home never did: a sense of choice. She could decide to see him, even if it was only in secret. She could be herself without always playing the role of top student and obedient daughter. Their relationship was ordinary on many levels, consisting of the kinds of dates and late-night conversations most high school couples share. Yet the very fact that it was forbidden made it feel more powerful. It was not just love, it was relief from all the weight she carried at home. When her parents eventually found out about the relationship, they responded in the way Jennifer expected. They banned it completely. Any form of dating was considered a distraction, but Daniel's background sealed the decision. Han and Bitch insisted she end it, cutting off one of the only lifelines she felt connected to the outside world. What they intended as discipline instead deepened her attachment to Daniel. The secrecy of continuing to see him made their connection stronger. To Jennifer, this was no longer a simple relationship, it was rebellion. The effort required to keep Daniel hidden was exhausting, but it also gave her a sense of power. In a life where most choices were made for her, she now had something entirely her own. Lying to her parents about grades and school life had already become her pattern. Extending those lies to cover a secret romance only solidified how far she was willing to go to maintain control over some part of her identity. The more her parents pushed, the more she clung to Daniel as proof that she could live by her own rules. Friends later described Jennifer as someone who desperately wanted independence. With Daniel, that independence felt real. They had to plan carefully. Meeting places were arranged, messages exchanged, and excuses crafted to cover gaps in time. Every successful meeting behind her parents' backs reinforced the idea that their control was not absolute, that she could outsmart them. This was thrilling to Jennifer, but it was also a dangerous reinforcement. The secrecy turned the relationship into something more consuming than it might have been under normal circumstances. As their relationship grew, tension at home grew with it. Every confrontation with her parents became charged with resentment. She began to see them less as protectors and more as obstacles standing between her and her happiness. For teenagers, such feelings are not uncommon, but in Jennifer's life the stakes felt higher. Years of strict rules, the web of lies surrounding school, and now the forbidden relationship, all combined to create a deep sense of entrapment. She did not simply want freedom, she felt she needed it to survive. There was also the matter of image. Han and Bitch believed Jennifer was a model student destined for success, someone who would someday become a doctor or a pharmacist. Jennifer played that role daily, but with Daniel she did not have to. With him, she could be the version of herself that her parents would never accept. That difference made being with him not just comforting, but essential. When pressure at home increased, she leaned harder into the relationship, finding in it the escape she could not get anywhere else. The secrecy also had a bonding effect. Psychologists often note that forbidden relationships can feel more intense because the struggle to maintain them turns each partner into the other's only ally. That was the case for Jennifer and Daniel. For her, every risk of being caught was proof of her commitment. For him, the restrictions made being with Jennifer feel like a mission they were on together. The hidden texts, the planned encounters, and the fear of discovery did not weaken their relationship. They strengthened it. This shift did not go unnoticed by her parents. The more Jennifer resisted, the more they doubled down on their rules. They viewed Daniel as a threat and acted accordingly. Once again, what they considered necessary protection only fueled Jennifer's determination to resist. Every threat of punishment made her more certain that her parents were the problem, not Daniel, and every moment spent planning around them eroded what little trust remained between them. Resentment soon began to dominate her view of her parents. Rather than appreciating their sacrifices, Jennifer grew convinced they were barriers to her happiness. She watched friends move freely in relationships, pursue normal lives, and make choices without every detail scrutinized. In contrast, she lived in a house where every action was measured. It reinforced an us versus them mentality, with Daniel becoming her partner not only in romance, but in defiance. Having experienced some level of control over her school lies, Jennifer began to imagine that she could manage this situation too. But unlike academics, romance had emotional stakes that were harder to contain. Her attachment to Daniel was not built only on affection, it was reinforced by the thrill of forbidden love and the urgency of needing someone on her side. By making him the symbol of her independence, she risked making her parents seem like the enemies in a conflict where compromise felt impossible. As her double life expanded, Jennifer stood at the crossroads of two realities. In one, she was the daughter her parents expected, dutiful, high-achieving, and obedient. In the other, she was the partner in a secret relationship where she could make her own choices, even if those choices were based on deception. These two versions of Jennifer could not exist together forever. The more intense her relationship became, the more fragile her performance at home grew. Eventually, confrontation was bound to follow. When it finally did, and when her parents discovered yet more lies surrounding her life, they responded with drastic measures. They issued an ultimatum, one that restricted her freedoms even further and pushed her deeper into desperation. What they could not see was how the forbidden relationship had shifted Jennifer's mindset. It was not just about wanting a boyfriend anymore. It was about wanting control of her own existence, no matter the cost. That drive for independence, sharpened by secrecy and strengthened by defiance, would become the turning point in Jennifer's life. The hidden romance had given her a kind of courage, but it was courage built on lies and rebellion. It showed her that rules could be broken without immediate destruction, and it planted the idea that her parents' control could be resisted in more extreme ways. The forbidden bond between Jennifer and Daniel was not simply one obstacle in her path, it became the foundation for what came next. And when her parents brought everything to a breaking point with new restrictions, Jennifer's desperation turned from secrecy and lies into something far more dangerous. By the time Jennifer's web of lies began to come apart, her parents' patience had worn thin. It was not just school reports or fabricated achievements anymore. They realized how deeply she had been deceiving them, not only about academics, but also about her relationship with Daniel Wong. For Han Pan in particular, it was the last straw. He had worked hard to build a life in Canada, and his vision of success centered on his children reaching careers he never could. Watching that plan collapse under dishonesty and defiance ignited a tougher response. What followed was an ultimatum that would change the course of everything. The restrictions came fast and without compromise. Jennifer was told she could no longer see Daniel. Contact of any kind was forbidden. Her parents took away her phone when they were home, cutting off her ability to communicate freely. Every movement she made outside the house was monitored. If she left for work, piano lessons, or school-related responsibilities, one of her parents drove her there and picked her up again. To Han and Bitch, this was a way to regain control. To Jennifer, it felt like another wall being built around her. Han took the lead in enforcing the rules. Friends of the family later remembered how much pride he took in structure and how determined he was to repair what he saw as Jennifer's drifting life. His solution was supervision. He made the boundaries clear, and he expected her to obey without exception. From his perspective, this was the only way to stop more lies from spiraling. According to his own testimony, he even warned Jennifer directly about Daniel. "End it now," he said, "or wait till I am dead." It was a striking line that revealed how firmly he believed this relationship stood in the way of her future. Jennifer, however, experienced this differently. Instead of feeling guided, she felt trapped. At school, classmates her age were making their own decisions, pursuing relationships, and finding independence. At home, she was a young adult, still being driven to and from every location. Her phone checked, her social life erased. She had built her teenage years around secrecy, creating spaces where she could pretend to have autonomy. Now even the illusion was gone. Every hour was under watch. Every attempt to stretch for independence was blocked. The sense of isolation tightened. Her parents thought discipline would save her. Jennifer believed it was cutting off her only oxygen. By forbidding Daniel, they attacked the one part of her life that felt like hers. To remove him meant removing hope that she could live outside their strict expectations. Rather than pulling her back onto the path they envisioned, the ultimatum closed her off further. At night, her thoughts circled around the impossible situation. She was not just under rules, she was in a cage. From the outside, constant monitoring might have looked like tough love parents trying to reset boundaries after years of lies. But inside Jennifer's world, the decision hardened resentment. Where she once felt guilty for deceiving, she now defined lying as survival. Rules designed to break the bond with Daniel only fused them closer. Rules meant to heal the breach between daughter and parents only widened the cracks. The ultimatum was a test of obedience, but Jennifer did not see it as a choice. She saw it as the moment her parents stood entirely in the way of her future. This mindset escalated quickly. When a child sees parents as guardians of opportunity, discipline can be tolerated, but when a young adult sees parents as barriers to freedom, efforts at control can ignite defiance. For Jennifer, who had already lived years constructing fictions to please them, the next step moved far beyond another forgery or excuse. She began imagining life without their interference at all. It was at this emotional boiling point that the thought hardened into possibility. If her parents would not allow her to be with Daniel or have independence, then perhaps the only escape was to remove them from the equation entirely. What had started as pressure to meet high marks and obedience had turned into a spiral of lies. The ultimatum forced her to face a wall she could neither climb over nor negotiate, and in her mind, the only solution became erasing the wall itself. The hard truth is that many young adults in strict homes dream about escape. Some leave home early, others build distance gradually. Jennifer had been trained by years of secrecy to see deceit as her primary tool. When her parents cut off every avenue, she did not look for open discussion or compromise. She looked for permanence, elimination, freedom through absence. Han and Bitch, of course, did not imagine discipline would lead here. They were parents who believed order would save their family, but their determination to set limits collided with Jennifer's determination to escape them. This clash was more than generational. It was a full standoff. One side unbending in rules, the other unbending in desire. Neither side could accept the other. As the days passed under strict watch, Jennifer's thoughts moved from frustration to planning. Each ride to school reinforced her lack of control. Each search of her phone reminded her that nothing was private. Each condition pushed her further towards seeing life not as something to endure, but something to escape by drastic means. In her mind, discipline had ended the possibility of choices. In its place came dark decisions that would shock everyone around her. By then, the idea of removing her parents was no longer a passing fantasy. It grew into concrete consideration. Who would do it? How would it look? What would life be like afterward? These were not questions asked by chance, but questions asked as part of forming a plan. And the first step of that plan would be reaching out to people who might be willing to carry out what she could not. The ultimatum meant to save Jennifer from her double life did not work. It backfired. It marked the line where her lies, her secrecy, and her resentment transformed into something lethal. Her restrictions became her motive. Her sense of entrapment became her justification. And for the first time, she began to imagine not a future dictated by expectation, but a future free of her parents altogether. That shift in thought was decisive. Discipline was supposed to correct her mistakes. Instead, it convinced her to pursue a way out that no parent could have foreseen. Jennifer had reached a point where compromise no longer seemed possible in her mind. After years of deception, years of being watched, and years of trying to live in two worlds, she believed she had arrived at her final option. But how does someone even move from the idea of escape to connecting with people who would kill? How does a young woman in suburban Ontario find individuals willing to carry out a murder for hire? Those questions defined the next stage of the story, as Jennifer's desperation shifted from thought into action. Jennifer Pan told Daniel Wong that she wanted her parents gone. For her, the restrictions at home had become unbearable, and she convinced herself that killing them was the only way to live freely. At first, this was only talk, but it soon shifted into action. Rather than planning an escape from her household, Jennifer began looking for people who could carry out something far more extreme. What started as private complaints turned into serious discussions about murder for hire, arranged through Daniel and his contacts. Her first attempts were clumsy. Investigators later learned that she had spoken to acquaintances like Andrew Montemayor and Ricardo Duncan about finding someone who might do the job. Nothing came of these early interactions, but they showed the direction her thoughts were taking. Jennifer was no longer imagining alternatives to her life at home. She was actively asking about ways to make death a solution. These failed attempts did not stop her. Instead, they primed her for the next step with Daniel, who had closer ties to people willing to consider the request. With Daniel's involvement, the idea gained focus. He introduced her indirectly to individuals tied to criminal circles, including Lenford, Roy Crawford. Jennifer's communication with them was not reckless. It was hidden. She used a separate SIM card and iPhone, devices purchased and kept separate from the phone her parents monitored, to carry out conversations about the plan. The use of this equipment was later a key piece of evidence. It showed how she had taken deliberate steps to mask what she was doing, not just in her home but in every aspect of her daily routine. The conversations soon shifted from vague interests to concrete planning. Money was central. Jennifer claimed she could pay $10,000 for the killings. That money, according to accounts presented later, would come from her future inheritance. She believed she stood to receive around $500,000 once her parents were gone. The lure of that financial independence, combined with her desire to be with Daniel outside her parents' control, made the idea more real. It tied love and freedom together with profit, giving her more than one reason to push forward. At first, Jennifer's target was only her father, Han. He had taken the lead on enforcing the ultimatum, and in her mind, he was the harshest barrier to her relationship and freedom. But her view shifted. Leaving her mother alive meant that control and disapproval would remain in the house. If she wanted to be rid of all restraints, then both parents would need to be gone. That change in the plan, from one victim to two, was a major shift. It clarified to those who later studied the case that she had decided on total removal rather than partial escape. The agreements continued through a network rather than direct contracts. Daniel remained her point of contact, bridging between Jennifer and others, like Crawford and Eric Sean Carty, who played roles in connecting with David Mulvaganam, the man charged as one of the shooters. This chain of communication gave Jennifer some distance from those who would actually commit the acts. But it also demonstrated a layer of planning that added weight to the charges. She had not been impulsive. She had gone looking for a structured way to see her parents killed. The timing and coordination were not random either. Records later displayed more than 100 text messages exchanged between Jennifer and Daniel in the hours leading up to the attack. These were not casual notes. They were check-ins, confirmations, and reminders that revealed the build-up to the night of the crime. Each message was part of a countdown, narrowing the distance between years of deception and the violence that would follow. It is important to recognize that her motive was not only emotional or financial, but both. On one hand, Jennifer wanted Daniel and the freedom of being with him without restrictions. On the other, she saw the possibility of securing a large inheritance that could finance a new life. Together, these goals reinforced each other. Free from parents, she would have independence. With inheritance, she would have security. The idea wrapped itself into a vision of life she thought she could finally control. When presented at trial, this combination of financial expectation and emotional desperation became a central theme. Prosecutors argued that Jennifer was not only tired of her parents' control, but motivated by the wealth their deaths would provide. In their telling, this was not just about stress or youthful rebellion. It was about planning cold, organized, and committed. The $10,000 price tag showed how far she was willing to go, reducing her parents' lives to a transaction that could be settled with cash. The details also raised questions of complexity. Why pursue murder instead of escape? Why not move away or cut ties? For Jennifer, those alternatives must not have felt possible. Her years of lying had closed off simpler paths. In her mind, the only way to avoid exposure and rejection was to eliminate the source of pressure altogether. By choosing this route, she escalated conflict with her parents into a decision that was permanent. The secrecy, forged over years, now served its darkest purpose. By the time everything was in place, Jennifer had moved from forging grades and fabricating her education to arranging the most irreversible deception of all. She was no longer playing student, no longer pretending loyalty. She was shaping a reality where inheriting money and living with Daniel would replace the life she had at home. It was not escape in the sense of leaving quietly. It was escape through orchestrated death, carried out through people who would break into her family home. For the conspirators, the plan looked simple. Stage the scene as a home invasion robbery. Keep Jennifer alive so she appeared to be a victim. Make the murders look like the violent aftermath of a break-in. This setup was supposed to hide her role and leave her free to collect what she wanted. The chain of planning, the devices bought to conceal communication, the money promised, these all formed the structure of a crime that was meant to look accidental. Jennifer had started with complaints about strict parents and dreams of life with Daniel. She ended with a structured agreement for their destruction, putting a dollar amount on freedom and linking it to inheritance. What should have been conversations about growing independence had turned into arrangements for murder. Instead of finding another path forward in life, Jennifer prepared a path through death. Once the plan was in place, time was the only barrier. Jennifer and Daniel had laid the groundwork, reached the people willing to carry it out, and prepared the frame of the cover story in advance. They were past imagining and into awaiting execution. And the moment that awaited them arrived on a cold November night when three men stepped into the Pan household and shattered it forever. On the night of November 8th, 2010, the Pan family house in Markham, Ontario, looked quiet from the outside. Inside, Jennifer Pan was upstairs in her room, keeping in touch with Daniel Wong over text. The conversation was not casual. Records later showed that she was coordinating last details of the plan that had been forming for months. Her parents, Han and Bitch, had gone about their evening unaware that anything unusual was about to happen. For them, it was just another Monday night. At some point after Jennifer exchanged those messages, she made sure the front door was unlocked. This detail would later matter to investigators because there was no sign of forced entry. The men who arrived did not have to break in. They walked directly inside. 3 men entered the Pan house, moving with purpose and demanding money. Jennifer stayed upstairs, listening as her plan took shape in real time. Her role was to appear a victim, not a participant. The men confronted Han and Bitch quickly. Both parents were startled, and the situation turned physical when the intruders brandished guns and ordered them to comply. Using duct tape, they bound Han and Bitch, forcing them to lie face down. The tape was applied tightly around their arms and heads, leaving little room for movement or air. Jennifer, by contrast, was soon tied herself, but in a way that seemed unusual. Instead of being restrained harshly, her wrists were tied loosely to the banister. Her bindings would allow enough slack for her to move her fingers later and dial her phone. That difference, the harsh treatment of her parents and the gentle restraint of Jennifer, would not go unnoticed. In the middle of the chaos, Han and Bitch were forced toward the master bedroom, while demands for cash continued. The men searched the room and grabbed what they could, including about $2,000 in cash from Jennifer herself. Large valuables, however, were mysteriously untouched. Electronics, jewelry, and other signs of wealth that robbers usually target were left behind. At the time, this looked strange, but in the dark urgency of the moment, the parents had no time to process why. They were under direct threat, dragged by armed men who appeared determined to inflict violence. The invaders' ultimate destination was the basement. Han and Bitch were led down the stairs, duct tape again pressed to their faces and eyes. Jennifer, still upstairs near the banister, was not moved along with them. This separation made her the only family member spared from direct gunfire. Downstairs, the men positioned her parents on the floor. Without hesitation, shots rang out. Han was struck in the head but not killed immediately. Bitch, his wife, suffered multiple gunshot wounds that ended her life in the basement of the family home. Jennifer remained upstairs during this. Accounts confirm she did not cry out as many would expect. She gave the 911 dispatcher later an impression of panic, but at the moment, violence was unfolding below. She appeared restrained, almost composed. Her bindings left her largely unharmed, as though her role was meant to be surviving witness rather than target. This outcome suited the story she and Daniel had fashioned, a staged robbery that left her alive to report it. Minutes later, the 3 men fled the house. With them, they carried a small amount of cash but left behind many other valuables. Police would later call this another indicator that robbery was never the true motive. Once gone, Jennifer managed to use her loosely bound hands to retrieve her phone and call 911. On that call, she begged for help, framing herself as the terrified daughter who had barely survived. At first, to the dispatcher, it sounded convincing. When officers arrived at the Pan home, they found Bitch's body in the basement. Han lay nearby, bleeding heavily from his head wound. The scene was violent, littered with duct tape and chaos. But what struck officers was Jennifer herself. She was upstairs, uninjured beyond the flimsy tape that barely held her. Unlike her parents, she showed no signs of rough treatment, no imprints on her skin from tight bindings, and no indication that she had struggled. For a supposed robbery gone wrong, this seemed unusual. At the hospital that night, doctors worked quickly to save Han Pan. Against odds, he survived multiple gunshot wounds, though the attack left him blind in one eye and severely impaired in the other. His survival would become pivotal, because while Jennifer's version of events painted her as another victim, Han's eventual testimony would reveal contradictions. For now, though, he lay in critical condition, his voice unable to share what he had seen and heard in that basement. The image presented to investigators at first glance was staged, but not well. A robbery designed for realism would have included more effort to loot valuables. It would have restricted Jennifer with force equal to her parents. It would not have left her able to call for help so quickly. Each of these smaller details stacked together to create something police could not overlook. Jennifer's behavior was another piece of the puzzle. At the scene, witnesses recalled she was distraught, but not in a state consistent with someone who had watched a parent gunned down. Her tears came at intervals. Her voice rose high when repeating to officers what had happened, but moments later, she would calm and appear ready to answer questions clearly. That alternating rhythm, struck some investigators as rehearsed. Forensic work reinforced suspicion. No doorframe had been damaged, no window was pried. The intruders entered calmly through a door Jennifer herself admitted leaving unlocked. In most robbery cases, victims are treated roughly to avoid witnesses later identifying the offenders. But in this case, Jennifer was clearly spared harm. The invasion appeared to have less interest in property and more focus on those two parents. In the days following, the picture began to shift. Han's survival meant he could speak. Once he regained consciousness, he slowly shared his account. How the men led him and his wife downstairs, how Jennifer remained upstairs, and how the entire sequence unfolded without her being treated as a true hostage. His memories provided investigators with a direct contradiction to Jennifer's story that she had been helpless throughout. The so-called robbery now looked like something more coordinated. The intruders had followed a path directly in line with Jennifer's preparation. They were not random burglars stumbling upon a house with wealthy occupants. They were there for a targeted purpose. And when one of the two intended victims lived long enough to describe it, the deception Jennifer had carefully built started to crumble. What happened in the Pan household that November night could no longer be explained away as a brutal accident of circumstance. It was the consequence of planning, deception, and intentional violence. Jennifer had wanted the scene staged, as if she survived a home invasion, but her father's survival shattered that image. His recovery offered the testimony that exposed cracks too big to ignore. With Han still in recovery, police began comparing his version with Jennifer's recorded call. Each inconsistency pushed them closer to doubt. Each difference suggested that what happened was no random act of terror, but a crime written into the very walls of the family home before that night even began. And soon, the survivor's testimony would become the key in unraveling Jennifer's entire story. Doctors at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto could hardly believe that Han Pan was still alive. He had been shot at close range in the face and had also suffered wounds that left him in critical condition. At first, it seemed almost certain that he would not survive. He was rushed there after being stabilized at a smaller local hospital, and when he finally regained consciousness, it was described as extraordinary. His survival was not just a miracle of medicine, it became the key that changed the entire investigation into the attack on the Pan family. Still heavily injured, Han began to speak about what he remembered that night. These details became vital because Jennifer's 911 call had presented her as a terrified young woman, helplessly bound while intruders destroyed her family. Investigators had already questioned this version of events, but until Han was able to talk, they lacked a first-hand witness to confirm the suspicions that had begun forming. His testimony proved to be the thread that tied everything together. Han told police that during the invasion, his daughter had not appeared to be treated roughly at all. He recalled her speaking quietly to one of the men, but not in the kind of panicked tone he expected. Instead, in his words, she whispered to the gunman, in a friendly and soft manner. This stood in stark contrast to the girl who later sobbed to the 911 dispatcher that she had been kidnapped and could not move. For police, this was no minor contradiction. It was the first clear indication from a victim that Jennifer had been spared and that her behavior seemed suspicious. As investigators compared Han's account with Jennifer's, more gaps became obvious. She had described the invasion as terrifying chaos, yet Han remembered watching her sit away from the violence, apparently unharmed, and interacting with the intruders in ways that did not match a frightened hostage. Jennifer claimed she was tightly bound, yet managed to call police within minutes after the gunmen left. Han confirmed that while he and Bitch had tape wrapped tightly over their heads and bodies, his daughter's restraints were not applied the same way. These mismatches added weight to the feeling that the robbery story was not genuine. The fact that Han could even describe what had happened gave the investigation momentum it would not have had otherwise. If he had died that night, Jennifer's account might have stood much longer without contradiction, but his voice gave detectives reason to dig more aggressively. Han remembered details, being led downstairs, being left with his wife, and hearing his daughter upstairs when she was supposedly in danger too. He remembered the gunfire and how he blacked out from the shots, certain he was dying. That he awoke later in a hospital bed, still able to recall the final minutes before he collapsed, was remarkable. For prosecutors, Han's survival created a turning point. Jennifer's entire performance relied on the idea that she was a victim, yet her own father, the man she had targeted, was still alive and testifying about her unusual behavior. It was impossible to dismiss or explain away. His statement about her whispering gently to the gunman was particularly damaging. It suggested a level of familiarity that could not fit into her role as an innocent daughter. That single observation raised the possibility that she was cooperating with the intruders rather than hiding from them. The physical evidence already left investigators uneasy. There was no forced entry. Valuables were left untouched, and Jennifer was unharmed. But with Han's testimony layered on top, the story hardened. It painted a picture of selective brutality, where one family member was spared by design, while the others were bound and shot. Han became proof of that distinction. His wife was murdered. He himself was nearly killed. Yet Jennifer walked away with nothing more than light tape on her arms. These facts could not be ignored, and now they were being said aloud by the surviving victim. Han's willingness to testify also carried emotional weight. He had lost his wife, suffered life-changing injuries, and discovered that the daughter he raised was not the victim she claimed to be. Despite that, he chose to talk. Each detail about the night added layers to the prosecution's case, while also dismantling the daughter's carefully created role. Whatever sympathy her tearful calls had won began to fade once her father's version was heard. At trial, Han's survival was presented as both extraordinary and devastating. Extraordinary in the sense that very few survive such close-range shots. Devastating, because his testimony directly implicated his own child. Without him, the Crown would have relied far more on cell phone records and circumstantial evidence. With him, they had words from the man who was there. That made the difference between suspicion and certainty. Jennifer's scheme had relied on silence. Her plan demanded that both parents die, so that no one inside the house could contradict her story. But her father's survival had undone everything. By living, Han had destroyed the narrative she had worked so hard to stage. His voice shifted the case from wondering if she was lying to proving she had been. The police no longer had to rely only on tone analysis of her 911 call or speculation about loose duct tape. They had the surviving victim himself, explaining how his daughter's role that night was not what she claimed. For Jennifer, every moment her father spoke in court was another wall collapsing. His testimony left her without the protection of her own family's silence. Instead, the truth was coming directly from him. The very man she had planned to erase became the crucial witness exposing her. As one detective later described, Han's survival was fatal to Jennifer's fabricated story. The brutality of that November night had left Han permanently injured. He lost vision in one eye and lived with lasting trauma from the attack. Yet his recollections became the key to exposing his daughter's role in orchestrating what happened. The investigation gained credibility not from advanced technology or hidden informants, but from the surviving parent himself. He had seen enough, remembered enough, and said enough to unravel his daughter's version of events. In many ways, the unraveling did not depend on investigators alone. It depended on the patient testimony of a father who was not supposed to live long enough to speak. His voice took the crime from a mystery about home invaders to an undeniable case of conspiracy between daughter and hitmen. Jennifer's attempt to appear like a survivor was undone by the survival of someone else, the very person meant to die. Han's survival turned into the prosecution's strongest weapon. More than text messages, more than inconsistencies, his memory carried power. As a result, Jennifer's lies began to collapse under their own weight. She could no longer shape the story. Her father's testimony had anchored the truth, and there was no way around it. Now, with the key victim alive and revealing what he saw, detectives had leverage they needed. It was time to press Jennifer herself. The next critical step in the process became the police interrogations, where inconsistencies in her story would be tested until they broke. In the weeks after the attack, Jennifer Pan was treated as a traumatized survivor, but investigators could not ignore the gaps in her account. With her father recovering and giving them key details, detectives decided it was time to press her harder. On November 22nd, 2010, she was called in for another interview at the York Regional Police Station in Markham. By then, she had already spoken with officers twice, always sticking to her story of being a helpless hostage. This time, however, detectives had a different approach lined up. The interview room was small and windowless, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. Detective William Goetz, a veteran familiar with tough questioning, was assigned to speak with her. He relied on the Reed technique, a method often taught to interrogators across North America. That approach is built around confrontation and psychological tactics, including deception about evidence. Legally, police in Canada are allowed to mislead suspects during questioning, and Goetz intended to use that advantage. It was not about physical pressure, but about reshaping her view of the facts, convincing her that denial was no longer an option. From the start, Jennifer repeated her earlier claims. She cast herself as the terrified daughter, tied to a banister, while strangers destroyed her family. She cried, and her voice trembled. But Getz did not accept her story at face value. Instead, he challenged her with the inconsistencies detectives had already noticed. Why were her bindings so loose compared to her parents? Why was she left unharmed when the others were shot? Why were valuables in plain sight ignored? These points had raised suspicion since the night of the crime. Now, in that room, each one was placed directly in front of her. When Jennifer stuck to her script, the detective shifted strategies. He began introducing claims about advanced investigative tools. At one point, he told her they had computer systems capable of analyzing the truthfulness of her statements. Later, he described satellite technology he said could track movements inside homes using infrared scans. None of this was real, but the point was not the tools themselves. The goal was to convince Jennifer that the police already knew more than she realized, that resisting would only make things worse. Faced with what she thought was overwhelming forensic proof, her confidence in her lies began to fracture. Hours into the questioning, her story started to bend. She first suggested that perhaps she was not simply a random victim at all, but that she had been the real target. At one point, she told Goetz that the whole event was connected to a supposed ransom scheme. According to this version, intruders had come for her, not her parents. It was a surprising shift, but it also deepened suspicions. The logic made little sense. Why would kidnappers shoot her parents and leave her unharmed? Each change she introduced only made the cracks in her narrative more obvious. The detective pushed on these weak points. He reminded her that her overall behavior during the night had not matched fear. He brought up her father's testimony that she had spoken softly to one of the gunmen, almost like a friendly exchange. He told her the evidence showed she had been orchestrating parts of the evening. Confronted again and again with contradictions, Jennifer had no space to retreat. The pressure to explain herself built steadily with every question. After more than 2 hours in that room, Jennifer finally broke. Her admission did not come all at once. At first, she claimed she had been involved, but only because she wanted to end her own life. She told Goetz she had arranged for people to come into the house and kill her, not her parents. It was a confession, but framed in a way that cast her as desperate and self-destructive, not violent toward others. Detectives did not buy it. The reasoning clashed with the facts, and they had text messages linking her to discussions about targeting her parents, not herself. Once she admitted making contact with men willing to kill, the walls she had built around her story started to collapse. Investigators did not care if she presented it as a suicide plot or a failed contract. The important point was that she had acknowledged involvement. Her claim that she had tried to stage her own death allowed them to tighten the noose on her connection to Daniel Wong and the hired men. She revealed enough that detectives could show she was communicating directly with criminals before the shooting. That link was all the case needed to move beyond speculation and into proof. The use of the Reed technique had done its work. Confronted with fake technology, false claims of evidence, and relentless pressure, Jennifer altered her answers until her story no longer resembled what she had told the 911 dispatcher. By the end of that third interview, detectives had drawn from her the admission they needed. She had been in contact with the people who carried out the attack. Whether she continued to insist the plan had gone wrong or was misdirected did not matter. What mattered was that she could no longer pose as an innocent. Investigators later supported their case with more than just Jennifer's words. They collected data from her phones, tracked her movements, and analyzed over 100 text messages she and Daniel Wong exchanged in the 6 hours leading up to the crime. These records aligned with the timeline of the invasion, showing coordination rather than coincidence. When combined with her changing story, the evidence created a clear picture. She was not a hostage saved by luck. She was a planner whose carefully staged scheme had unraveled. That final confession, however partial, marked the turning point. Police could now tie Jennifer Pan directly to the group of intruders. They had her voice, her words, and her devices, all showing involvement. The image of the grieving daughter phoning 911 was stripped away, replaced by the reality of a young woman orchestrating her parents' deaths. For detectives, it was the moment where theory became certainty. The case was no longer just about a suspicious 911 call or a miraculous survival. It was about a planned murder for hire, now confessed to by the daughter who claimed to be its victim. The hours in that interrogation room had turned her performance against her. What she revealed under pressure was more damaging than anything the police could have proven with physical evidence alone. By admitting her role, even with excuses, she had implicated herself in the one way she could not escape. From that point forward, there was no pretending Jennifer Pan was only a witness. The interrogation shifted her legal status, her public image, and her future. Once her words were recorded on that tape, she was tied to the crime in a way she could never undo. And when the case finally reached a courtroom, Those admissions, stacked alongside phone records, testimony, and inconsistencies, would become the backbone of the prosecution's argument. What detectives pulled from Jennifer in that small room would later help the Crown secure convictions, not just against her, but against the men who carried out the attack. By the time jurors heard her shifting stories, her father's survival, and the pattern of messages leading to the shooting, public opinion turned fully against her. The interrogation had been the trap, and Jennifer herself had sprung it. Next, the trial would reveal the full scope of her lies, the careful construction of her double life, and the shock of the verdict that sealed her fate. In March 2014, Jennifer Pan walked into a courtroom in Newmarket, Ontario, charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. Beside her sat Daniel Wong, David Mulvaganam, and Lenford Crawford. Each faced charges for their part in the carefully arranged home invasion that left Bichha Pan dead and Han Pan critically injured. The trial would run for 10 months and would take jurors through years of deception, layers of hidden detail, and hours of testimony designed to answer one central question. Was this the plan of intruders gone wild, or the outcome of a daughter's secret plot? The prosecution set the stage by laying out the world Jennifer built out of lies. They presented forged report cards, fake university letters, and evidence of the secret phones she used to manage her relationship with Daniel Wong. They reminded the court that her parents had lived strict and honest lives, while their daughter lived in an alternate version, appearing as the model child in one room, while plotting a different reality in another. These lies, they said, were not small escapes. They were a pattern that eventually allowed her to imagine the murder-for-hire plot. In a room filled with jurors, lawyers, and an audience that included reporters, the court heard about the late-night text messages exchanged between Jennifer and Daniel. Over 100 messages were sent in the hours leading up to the murder, and these became central to the Crown's argument. They looked less like casual notes between a couple and more like steps in a countdown. The prosecution linked the timing of these conversations directly to the night when 3 men came in through an unlocked door, bound Jennifer's parents, and carried out the attack she later claimed surprised her. The theme of money played an important role in the case. Prosecutors argued that the promise of inheritance was a clear motive for Jennifer's role in arranging the deaths. She expected to gain $500,000 over time, and $10,000 was offered up front to those who carried it out. The courtroom heard this was not an impulsive lashing out by a frustrated daughter, but a calculation that weighed financial security against her parents' lives. Jurors were also presented with digital evidence tracing her steps. Jennifer owned 2 phones, the one her parents knew about, and another kept hidden. Information from those devices helped prosecutors show intentional concealment. According to the Crown, this was not a panicked decision but a carefully constructed series of choices that created plausible cover. The fake bindings on Jennifer, the unfinished ransacking of the home, and the fact that valuables were left behind were all described as features, not flaws, of the plan. Through testimony, the prosecution highlighted Han Pan's survival. Han gave his account of that night, telling the court that his daughter's behavior seemed different from what would be expected of a hostage. He explained that her parents were taped tightly and treated harshly. Jennifer was not. His account, that she whispered to one intruder in a friendly and soft manner, stood out to jurors, marking her role as something closer to collaborator than captive. The defense tried to establish doubt. They suggested Jennifer had no real intention of killing her parents, that her interactions with Daniel and others were the exaggerated words of a young woman overwhelmed by stress. Some of their arguments leaned on the idea that she never followed through on the decision, merely satisfied a fantasy with texts and conversations. But where the defense sought uncertainty, the prosecution pointed back to hard evidence. Actions taken before and during that night showed not distance from the act, but involvement in it. The media covered each phase of the trial in detail. Newspapers wrote about Jennifer's double life. Television crews waited outside the courthouse, and the case became widely discussed across Canada. Many within the Asian immigrant community followed with particular interest, as the strict household structure of the Pan family reflected a cultural experience familiar to them. For the broader public, it was the shock of a daughter planning violence against her own parents that gripped attention. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere grew heavy. As jurors were shown photographic evidence, they saw coroner images of bullet wounds, graphic displays of blood pooling in the family home, and heard testimony of the gunfire that killed Bitch in her basement. For many jurors, it was their first time exposed to such detail. The foreman, Patrick Fleming, later admitted the experience was lasting, that returning to normal life proved difficult, even after their work was done. Being sequestered for 4 days to deliberate only added to the strain, yet despite the emotional toll, jurors emerged with a clear decision. In December 2014, all four defendants, Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, David Milvaganam, and Lenford Crawford, were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Canada is life in prison with no parole for 25 years, and each received that outcome. The courtroom, crowded with media and members of the community, absorbed the weight of the decision. For Han, who survived the attack, it confirmed legally what he had already known. His daughter had arranged for his death and her mother's murder. One co-conspirator, Eric Carty, had been separated from the main trial when illness struck his defense lawyer. Later, he admitted guilt for conspiracy to commit murder, agreeing to an 18-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 9 years. He would die in prison in 2018, still serving time. Years later, the case continued inside legal systems. In May 2023, the Court of Appeal for Ontario ruled that the original trial judge had improperly instructed the jury, limiting their options to only a first-degree murder verdict, rather than considering possibilities like second-degree murder or manslaughter. A new trial was ordered on the murder charges, though the attempted murder convictions for Han Pan were upheld. In April 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld that decision with a 7-2 majority, agreeing that jurors should have had wider options when considering intent. For now, Jennifer and her accomplices face another trial, but their attempted murder sentences remain. The story that began with a stage-managed 911 call turned into one of the most closely followed trials in recent Canadian history. For years, the image of Jennifer Pan was debated: dutiful daughter, secret rebel, or manipulative criminal. But in the end, her fate was sealed, not by perception, but by verdict. She was sentenced to life in prison, not eligible for parole until she serves at least 25 years. Still, one question lingers over this case. How did the small lies of a teenager about grades, friends, and freedom grow into a plan that ended with her mother's murder and her father's permanent injury? That is the haunting question that remains.